If the learned and worldly wise men of this age were to allow mankind to inhale the fragrance of fellowship and love, every understanding heart would apprehend the meaning of true liberty and discover the secret of undisturbed peace and absolute composure. Baha'u'llah. So let us try, as an experiment, peace. And if the results of peace are bad, then we can choose if it will be better to go back to the old state of war. Let us, in any case, make the experiment. If we see that unity brings light, we shall continue it. For 6,000 years, we have been walking on the left-hand path. Let us walk on the right-hand path now. We have passed many centuries in darkness. Let us advance towards the light. Abdul Baha.
Thank you so much. So now I'll introduce our speaker for today, and just a reminder to save all your questions until after the talk when we'll have our question and answer portion. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can fill out the Google form that I will put in the chat. So our speaker this week, we're so excited to have, is Mr. Robert Ahdieh, and his topic is peace possible? Bobby Ahdieh is the Vice President for Professional Schools and Programs at Texas A&M University, Chief Operating Officer of Texas A&M's Fort Worth, and Dean of Texas A&M School of Law, a graduate of Radnor High School outside of Philadelphia, and then Princeton University and Yale Law School. He has taught at Emory, Georgetown, and Columbia universities prior to coming to Texas A&M. He has published widely, including the leading book on constitutional transition in post-Soviet Russia. In this presentation, he will speak to the possibility and nature of world peace. And with that, I'll hand it off to Mr. Ahdieh.
Thanks, Maya, for the kind introduction and for having me here today. It really is a great honor and pleasure to be with you all. On lots of counts. Let me begin with the Bayan introducing me, Paria offering those readings. I've had the real joy of knowing their mom, as well as their aunts and uncles, as well as their grandparents since I was younger than them. And they really are an incredible family, and we're so honored to have you as friends and as hosts of this wonderful occasion. I was also excited by the opening song, Bayan, that you shared. The performer of that song was actually a very good friend of mine and co-worker of mine in Israel now 35 years ago. We served at the Baha'i World Center, which is in Haifa, Israel, in northern Israel, there as volunteers for a year together. And so it really is a wonderful pleasure to be here with all of you. So before I begin in my remarks about is peace possible, I wanted to say a few words just by way of introduction for those who are new to the program or otherwise to the teachings of the Baha'i Faith. Say a couple of words about the Baha'i Faith, if you're not familiar with it. So Baha'i Faith is, we think of as the most recent world religion to come onto the global stage. I will actually say a few words later on about the notion that Baha'is have of progressive revelation, the idea that all religions have a common foundation and a common source in one God, but that they respond to different stages of human development and human history. And so Baha'is understand the Baha'i Faith, the Baha'i teachings, to be the teachings for this day and age, but we think of that as a natural progression from prior faiths, including Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, other religions. So it's cumulative, it's additive, rather than displacing or replacing. The core teachings of the Baha'i Faith, which originated in mid-19th century Iran, in the mid-1800s in Iran, but now has become one of the most widespread global religions in the world. 8-9 million followers distributed over almost every country on the planet. The core teachings revolve around the notion of unity, of oneness, common beliefs, and I'll say more about this in my remarks, the common bonds that hold us together, and the equality of all of us, the equality of women and men, the harmony of science and religion, the equality of all races. So this fundamental notion that what we are advancing as a human civilization is this common set of values, this commonality that holds us together. The Baha'i teachings also embrace kind of what I think of sometimes as a modernistic orientation. So the notion of having a common universal language so that all of humanity could communicate. The notion of, again, science and religion needing to be harmonized, that for human flourishing to occur, you need both wings of the bird to be strong. You need the rationality side of the rational faculty, the faculty of reason to be strong, but you also need the faculty of faith and religion to be strong. So the idea is that in the Baha'i teachings, through the Baha'i teachings, we are trying to harmonize those two together. So that's a little bit of a kernel. This is a global religion with, again, 8-9 million followers and, hundreds and hundreds of authoritative texts. So that's an oversimplification. But when we get to Q&A, I'm also happy to share further, respond to questions, share further reflections on the nature of the Baha'i teachings generally, separate and apart from what I'm going to talk about today. So the topic that I've been asked to comment on is peace possible? We came up with this topic in large part because we live at a moment when it doesn't look like peace is possible. If you look at the world today and you look at the conflicts that are immediately in front of us in Ukraine, in the Middle East, and again, it's worth noting, there are lots of visible conflicts like those, but there is a steady stream of less visible conflicts that we just don't, they're not in the headlines anymore. In Burma, Myanmar, there's ongoing conflict and war. In the Philippines, there's ongoing conflict and war. There are various pockets in the Americas as well. In Africa, there's a number of areas where there's significant conflict. So it is the case that today there are both these very visible conflicts that we see in the newspaper every day, Ukraine and Gaza being probably the most prominent of those. But there's also these other conflicts. So it really does beg this question of, is peace possible? Is there hope in that regard? So my first kind of reflection on that, or kind of to open that theme or engage that theme, I want to begin by noting that there are an array of positive indications that suggest peace is possible, that we can in fact accomplish peace, that peace is a realistic possibility that's out there. Not all of these are equally effective, not all of them are equally significant, but they all reflect elements of why peace is more possible today than it was a century ago or 2 centuries ago or the like. So to begin with, we can talk about institutions. There's an array of institutions we have in place. We talk about the United Nations oftentimes as the successor to the League of Nations. But there's an array of other institutions, the World Trade Organization, there's lots of them are acronyms, FATF, the ICC, the ICTYR. There's an array of these international institutions, none of which existed 50 years ago. In fact, many of which didn't exist even 20 years ago. So progressively, we are seeing over time the building of these institutions that would support a global Pax Humana, we call it, a global dynamic of peace. It's also the case that if we look at the kind of the dynamics on the ground of what the kind of the global order looks like, today, even compared to 50 years ago, let alone to 75 or 100 years ago, there is a degree of autonomy and independence among nation states that didn't exist previously. So even 50 years ago, there were a substantial number of what we now think of as independent nations that were operating under the umbrella of either a colonial or other great power kind of control, and lacked the kind of independence that they have now. The amount of cooperation, so as much as we see visibly in the headlines, conflict around Gaza, conflict around Ukraine, conflict in other places, the reality is that the global order today involves a massive amount of cooperation around the movement of goods, the movement of information, the movement of peoples, all of which, again, was dramatically more complex and limited in the past. The decrease in poverty. Poverty remains a persistent evil of our society, and I'll say more about that in a few minutes. But it is the case that the level of poverty and starvation in the world today has declined, and that reflects in some ways increased access to education, increased access to resources, so on and so forth. And I would say again, the changing role of women, and we can say minorities in our governments, in our social orders, in our structures, are also all ingredients of the creation of a global order of peace. So these are all positive indications. That I want to mention one other one separately, because it's less of an indication than a tool, and that's the role of technology in the world today. Now, as the father of 3 children, I'm not one to sort of, describe technology as an unmitigated good. It can be a distraction. It can be a challenge. It can create all sorts of difficulties. But it is the case that technology today has created the groundwork, or has created the connectivity for world peace in a way different than was true, again, even 5 or 10 years ago, right? It is today the case that the mass of humanity, including humanity in less developed countries, including those who are of relatively less means, have access to technology, have access to information that we didn't see before. And so I would highlight that as an important, not again necessarily manifestation of the opportunity for global peace, for world peace, but as a tool for us to potentially approach that goal. On the other hand, it's also the case that as we look around the world today, there are all sorts of indications that suggest to the contrary. So the prophet founder of the Baha'i Faith, by the name of Baha'u'llah, which means glory of God in Arabic, shared these words. He said, "The winds of despair are, alas, blowing from every direction, and the strife that divides and afflicts the human race is daily increasing. The signs of impending convulsions and chaos can now be discerned, inasmuch as the prevailing order appears to be lamentably defective." Now, he wrote those words more than 100 years ago, but I think it's fair to say they remain true today. When we look at it, again, I began by mentioning international structures such as the United Nations, but it turns out that the United Nations has not been nearly as effective as its founders had hoped. Even today, the United Nations is not living up to the promise that was hoped for. If we look at the global economic order that I talked about, global trade, many of those institutions are proving ineffective in the face of direct attacks and direct conflict. Terrorism has become kind of part of the vernacular, part of the familiar order that we live in. And notwithstanding the data about decreases in poverty and access to resources, it is the case that still millions upon millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions continue to experience intense and incredible suffering. Now, some of these negative phenomenon that I've just suggested, that I've described, may be reflective of, or our sense of these may be reflective of, in some ways, a lack of appreciation of the evolutionary nature of the human condition. So when we think of a human being, an individual human being, and we think of them as a newborn, as an infant, as a child, as a teen or a preteen, a teen, a young adult, an adult, and then an older adult, we have different expectations of what they're capable at different stages. And that is not only true of the child, the newborn, and the infant. It turns out we have different expectations of teens and even young adults than we do of older adults, of adults and older adults. And some of that is pure biology, right? The nature. Some of it is experience and the wisdom that comes from that experience and the exposures that people have. In some ways, we can think about institutions, including the institution of human society, as being reflective of that similar evolutionary arc or dynamic. So just as individuals go from infancy to childhood and beyond, humanity does that as well. Many of those periods, including periods of significant transition, think of adolescence, involve significant trauma, involve significant change and challenge and difficulty. Why? Because change is difficult, right? Because as I move from X to Y, it requires, in some sense, think about even a muscle, now down to the biology. The strengthening of a muscle involves what? Tearing of tissue, right? You are tearing tissue, and when you tear tissue, it then becomes stronger and grows. So similarly, humanity is going through this stage. Now, that's not to take anything away from the challenges and the horrors we face, but when we have that broader perspective of this evolutionary arc that humanity is going through, it gives us a vantage on where we are in that process and what it means that is perhaps different than it might be otherwise. At a deeper level, though, the cynicism or the doubts about the possibility of world peace can be understood to be a reflection of our sense of human nature, our notion that human nature, or the widespread notion, I should say, of human natures, humans as incorrigibly selfish, as aggressive, and therefore as incapable of putting in place structures that are other regarding, that are socially minded, that are about building a society versus advancing one's own interests. That assumption of human nature as at the extreme evil, but even if you don't want to assume evil, even if you just assume purely self-regarding, not other regarding, purely selfish, purely seeking to enhance one's own well-being, wealth, opportunity, so on and so forth. If that in fact reflects the reality of human nature, it does become more challenging to see the path to peace. Because if each of us are doing that, then no one is weighing effectively what are the social conditions that will make all of us thrive rather than just me thrive. And it's not always the case. My scholarship as a professor once upon a time was in game theory. In game theory is all about the strategic choices that individuals make with regard to the strategic choices others are making. Sometimes it's the case that my best interest is advanced by your best interest, but sometimes it's not. And when it's not, if you assume a purely selfish humans to be purely selfish, then that becomes more difficult. But again, it is entirely plausible. A different notion is that is not, in fact, human nature. That's a distortion of human nature. That in essence, certain failings, we'll talk more about, certain failings in our social order have bred or fostered or encouraged or allowed for those dimensions of human nature, what we might think of as the animalistic elements of our nature, to rise to the fore, and other elements of our nature, spiritual, divine, other regarding, moral characteristics of our nature, to not receive that same level of visibility and attention. Broadly, this notion of individual human nature as selfish reflects itself in social constructs that assume a kind of a materialistic or a materialism that defines our social structure, our social order. So here, when we think about kind of what is the nature of that material structure, it's worth noting for decades and decades, really you could say until recently, but even still to this day, but until the last decade or so, much of our conception of the global order was defined by two competing visions of the social order. One, the Marxist, socialistic, communistic model, and the other, the market-oriented capitalistic model. But what is interesting is that both of those models turn on a fundamental notion of materialism. Both of them, stripping away policies and structures and rules, fundamentally start from an assumption of human beings as materialistic in nature, right? So the core notion in Marxism is dialectic materialism. The core notion in capitalism is the accumulation of wealth. In both cases, the assumption about human nature, and hence the assumption about the social order that needs to be constructed, has materialism as at its core, at its center. What's the result of that? What follows from that distinctly materialistic orientation? A number of things. First, isolation. So it is the case that, and if you know, Robert Putnam is a social psychologist, a very prominent, famous social psychologist here in the United States. Years ago, he wrote a book called Bowling Alone. Bowling Alone. And the title referred to, part of the data he collected was the frequency with which people who went bowling bowled in leagues, participated in leagues, versus bowled by themselves. And what he found was that over time in the United States, participation in bowling did not go down. Participation in bowling leagues, however, collapsed. And his hypothesis, and he uses other examples as well, of course, is that fundamentally the capitalistic orientation of American society, that materialistic orientation, drove progressively an increasing level of isolation of individuals from others, right? So that materialistic mindset drives this isolation. It also creates distortions in the distribution of wealth. Again, something we'll come back to in a few minutes. But it creates distortions in the distribution of wealth, because if you assume a materialistic orientation, and this, to be fair, was true in communist countries as much as it was true in capitalist countries. And again, I lived in the Soviet Union once upon a time, and if in Q&A anyone is interested, I can tell you some of the jokes from that era that reflected the fact that even in the Soviet Union, there was this grotesque maldistribution of wealth. But this materialistic orientation produces this dynamic of haves and have-nots, that is problematic as a matter of maintaining social order, and I will suggest later, achieving peace. Finally, there's a malaise that comes from a materialistic orientation that is ultimate in terms of human well-being, how we think about our condition. There's this malaise, this almost depression, you could say, that arises from it. Why? Because it taps into part of our nature, and there's no, would not suggest to anyone that that is not part of our nature, but a purely materialistic social orientation appeals only to one part of our nature. And if we only appeal to that part of our nature, not the spiritual part of our nature as well, ultimately we will find ourselves kind of feeling dissatisfied with our condition, because those added elements are not being met. It's also the case that in that context, when you don't have this element of faith, this element of spirit, this element of transcendence beyond the material things that are in front of me, the tangible things, it fosters apathy and a lack of hope. So we become apathetic because, and all the data suggests that increasing wealth at some point, above some breakpoint, does not increase happiness. So it fosters this apathy and lack of hope, because there is no, if all that life is about is increasing your wealth, but increased wealth doesn't bring you more satisfaction, more joy, more happiness, then you become apathetic and hopeless about your condition. So this materialistic orientation really has created this dynamic that is an unhealthy one, that is a problematic one, and ultimately, I would say, is one that is inconsistent with the achievement of world peace, if that ultimately is our goal. The best evidence, I would say, that's an incomplete account of human nature, an incomplete account of the social condition, is the persistence of religion as a central part of the lives of so many in humanity, and not only among those who actively participate in religious organizations, but also those who at some fundamental deep level are seeking that spirituality, are seeking that spiritual meaning in their lives. The religion, in that sense, seeks to appeal to something deeper in who we are as human beings. What distinguishes us as human beings from animals is this quality of mind, right? This quality of mind and the resulting desire to rise above what is immediately in front of us, what we can see with our eyes, hear with our ears, smell with our nose, taste with our tongues. That inclines us in the direction of this transcendence, right? Again, something beyond, something spiritual, something greater. So what then becomes the role of religion? How should we think about the role of religion and the role that it can play in our lives, and not just individually, but as a social matter? When it's not there, I would suggest, and this is drawing from some language in the Baha'i writings, it produces that religion is a faculty of human nature, and that the perversion of this faculty has contributed to the confusion in society and the conflicts in and between individuals that cannot be denied. So this, in essence, is what religion, in the absence of religion, where we are. So what can we say about then the role of religion in our social order, and ultimately I will lead this to its role in advancing world peace? Very often, if our topic is conflict and war and peace, very often, of course, religion has been the source of that conflict. It is the case that when we look at conflicts around the world, not all conflicts, but religion oftentimes is a contributing factor, and sometimes really is the primary the core driver of that phenomenon, of that dynamic. I believe, however, that that's an incomplete account, in my view, is an incomplete account of what it is that that religion contributes and does. I want to share these couple of passages with you. The let me minimize this. The I put them up here. Can you see the screen? Oh, let me see. I can see someone who's can give me a signal. Is the screen there? Good. Okay, good. I see some heads nodding. The so let me. I'm going to hide this. Let me read these passages, and I thought it's helpful to see them, partially because there's a number of them, and the third one is kind of long. But also for us to reflect for a moment on them. So the first one, religion is the greatest of all means. These are from the Baha'i writings, I should emphasize. Religion is the greatest of all means for the establishment of order in the world and for the peaceful contentment of all that dwell therein. Should the lamp of religion be obscured, chaos and confusion will ensue, and the lights of fairness, of justice, of tranquility and peace cease to shine. The perversion of human nature, the degradation of human conduct, the corruption and disillusion of human institutions reveal themselves under such circumstances in their worst and most revolting aspects. Human character is debased, confidence is shaken, the nerves of discipline are relaxed, the voice of human conscience is stilled, the sense of decency and shame is obscured, conceptions of duty, of solidarity, of reciprocity and loyalty are distorted, and the very feeling of peacefulness, of joy, and of hope is gradually extinguished. Now, again, give you a moment to look at these. I won't take them down yet. Here's the reference that I oftentimes give for this as a lawyer and law professor. Fundamentally, societies need structures in order to maintain order, in order to maintain the relations among individuals, the relations among communities, the relation among societies, so on and so forth. Law can serve that role. However, law is limited in its capacity to provide that role unless there is universal and complete confidence in the law to serve that function. Even then, fundamentally, law relies on some underlying moral, spiritual, principled basis for saying I'm going to obey the law. So when you read these passages, even for those who might say, well, I'm not so sure about religion, think of law, right? Is it the case that we would not see these negative results, these horrifying results without law? Religion, in some sense, can be understood as the analog, at least in some societies at some points, and maybe one would argue as the foundational underpinning of law as well at some deeper level. Let me take this one down so we can see each other again. Okay, so that's one set of references for it. But then we might say to ourselves, how does that reconcile with, again, the experience many of us see today in the world of religion? What I would say is that we properly think about much of what we see of religion today as a distortion of the fundamental character of religion. So every religion, and this goes back to this Baha'i notion of progressive revelation, every religion, every individual, every institution has a life cycle where it starts in the springtime, into the summer of its heyday, into the fall of decline, and then into its winter. And then what happens? The institution gets revived in another form. Religion has a similar element to it. So where religion has progressed through these cycles, what happens over time is that it becomes distorted. It gets pulled and pushed in different directions. That doesn't change the fundamental truth and relevance and significance of the underlying faith, of the underlying values. It just means that we've distorted it in a variety of ways. I'm going to come back to one of the Baha'i principles that I mentioned at the outset of the harmony of science and religion. So one of the Baha'i notions is this idea of you need two wings to be strong, reason on the one side and faith on the other. And then what the Baha'i writings share is that if you have reason alone, if all you have is rationality and science, you end up with materialism. Now, you might say, well, okay, yes, and what's good is religion. No. The Baha'i writings likewise emphasize that if all you have is faith, you end up with fanaticism, right? So it really is the case that our thriving as individuals, our thriving as societies and as a social order depend on strength in both of these, on both of these wings, on both of these axes. And where religion operates in isolation from reason, rationality, science, et cetera, is where you get these distortions that that occur. Another way to get at this is to think about the fundamental truths, I should say, of all the religions. So we talk about the golden rule: do unto others as you would have done unto you. And it turns out in every faith you can find the permutation, the essence of that notion. There is, as such, not a fundamental conflict between the core values, the foundational values that motivate each religion. The conflict arises from this distortion, from this seasonal life cycle of one religion has kind of run its course in terms of serving the needs of humanity for this stage, and then God sends a new messenger to carry humanity through its next phase, and then the next phase. We talked about this also, the metaphor of school. So when you are in first grade, I don't remember anymore when the grades are, when things happen in grades, but in first grade, you learn about the numbers, and you learn about numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Then you get to second grade and they teach you the concept of zero. Then you get to third or fourth grade and they teach you the idea of negative numbers, -1, -2, -3. Then you get to the next grade, fourth grade or whatever it is, you get fractions. Then you get decimals. And then eventually in high school, you get imaginary numbers, right? Now, is it the case that your calculus teacher in high school disagrees with your first grade teacher? No, you were not capable of understanding imaginary numbers or even decimals or fractions when you were in first grade. You couldn't even understand zero at that stage. So progressively, this common curriculum, we might call it Creator, God, whatever you want to call it, is sending us teachers who are progressive at building on this. If we think about religion through that lens, we can see the parallel with what I said earlier about the evolution of humanity broadly, right? Divine teachers are coming from God to prepare us progressively to navigate the next phase of our social human journey, right? Humanity's journey, and then the next phase and the next phase after that. The result of, though, minimizing the place of religion is that we have created something of a vicious cycle in which the lack of religion and the lack of emphasis on religion and faith reinforces our materialistic, selfish orientation. So the idea is that people don't care about things beyond themselves. Why? Because we are not calling them to care about things beyond themselves. And because they only care about themselves, then that in turn leads to a lack of confidence or a lack of belief in the possibility of something greater, the possibility of something better, the possibility of peace. Fundamentally, then, to change that, to shift that, it's essential that we change our thinking. And here again, I want to read a passage from the Baha'i writings. I probably should have put this one up too. It's a little long, but I'll read it slowly. But a passage that conveys this idea that when we look at the world around us today, it's critical that we acknowledge the shortcomings of the value systems, the structures, the materialistic orientation that we have been focused on, and instead move in the direction of something different. So again, bear with me, this passage from the Baha'i writings. If long cherished ideals and time-honored institutions, if certain social assumptions and religious formula have ceased to promote the welfare of the generality of mankind, if they no longer minister to the needs of a continually evolving humanity, so if any of those are true, let them be swept away and relegated to the limbo of obsolescent and forgotten doctrines. Why should these, in a world subject to the immutable law of change and decay, be exempt from the deterioration that must needs overtake every human institution? For legal standards, political and economic theories are solely designed to safeguard the interests of humanity as a whole, and not humanity to be crucified for the preservation of the integrity of any particular law or doctrine. I understand that passage to highlight for us this fundamental need to step back and say, is it working? Is it the case that when we look at the value systems, the institutions, the structures, the orientations that we have today, if they are not working, why is it that they are different than everything else, ourselves included, that goes through these seasonal cycles of birth, rise, decline, and passage? If they are not different than that, then we should acknowledge and recognize that fundamental rethinking about how we approach humanity, how we think about who we are as humans and our role is in order. It is oftentimes said that that on Sunday mornings, we are at our most segregated. That when you look at kind of American society today, it's on Sunday morning that we are most divided into our not just creeds, but even our races and so on and so forth. The Baha'i community represents, I believe, a counterexample to that. And before I turn, as we leave the topic of religion specifically, to turn, what does that mean for then our broader theme of the possibility of peace? I want to sort of highlight for all of you the Baha'i community as an example, not a perfect example by any stretch of the imagination, but an example of what we might imagine this kind of structure would look like. The Baha'i community kind of operates really as draws on multiple nations, multiple cultures, multiple classes and creeds, but operates really as a organic, single social organism. It relies on consultative principles to make decisions. It equally values, again, reason and faith. And it brings together this incredible diversity of humankind in the pursuit of this cause. So I would encourage you, if it's of interest, to look to the Baha'i community as an attempt really to model the possibilities that we have here. All right, so if the goal is to move forward to peace, then what is it that needs to happen? And again, I've already highlighted one piece of that, which is this element of that faith and spirituality and morality must be part of the equation if we are to get there. So what do we need to do then to move in the direction of world peace, of global peace? The first thing we have to recognize is that this is not an exercise in solving one-off conflicts. If tomorrow we could end the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, we would not have achieved peace by any stretch of the imagination. It's not even close. So no agreement, no treaty, no set of treaties produces it by itself. Part of that is that, again, to my point early on about the way in which we have moved in the direction of peace, we are now a global society. You might like it, you might not like it, but it's the reality of where we are today in a significant way. And given that global reality, no single conflict represents the whole. No single issue represents the whole. We all know that. We recognize it. There is no actor who really truly believes, no actor of significance who truly believes that you can go under your shell or you can isolate yourself or hide yourself in that way. And in fact, we have moved a long way in that direction, as I pointed out. But those same notions about human nature stand in the way of taking the next step. We think that given the fundamental selfishness, the fundamental individualistic orientation of individuals and even of nations, that it's not possible to move to that next stage of a common order. Now, what more fundamentally are the things that we need to address to move us forward in the direction of global peace, of world peace? A few that I would highlight. First, I would start with racism. The Baha'i writings describe aspects of racism as the most challenging issue that we face. Racism, in some sense, is corrosive fundamentally of the possibility of social progress, because if we say something about the immutable characteristics of an individual are dispositive of who they are, we are condemning ourselves in some sense to failure. We're condemning ourselves to an inability to ever achieve a higher set of goals, a higher level of achievement beyond that. So unless we universally embrace and reject, embrace the rejection of racial classification, of racism as part of the way in which we normatively evaluate the society, we can't achieve peace. It's impossible. I mentioned a number of times now the disparity in wealth between rich and poor. It is the case that very, very few, if any, societies in the world today have effectively addressed this issue. Again, there may be some ways in which we have reduced it, so the level of poverty is somewhat less, but that pattern of reduced poverty on the bottom end has been coupled with just explosive increases in wealth among. So although we may have somewhat less poverty, although still a great deal, it is the case that the discrepancy and the suffering that still so many encounter, so many face, is unacceptable in a world in which so much wealth is accumulated by so few. And so engaging and addressing through the expertise of multiple disciplines, multiple individuals, multiple societies, this issue of the maldistribution of wealth will be a critical element of achieving world peace. Nationalism. Now, here I always want to emphasize that there is nothing inconsistent with patriotism, with national commitment and loyalty. There's nothing inconsistent with that. In fact, in some sense, it may be a critical component of accomplishing it. In other words, nation states may be the critical building block of world peace in a way that single individuals or cities or communities or counties or states would not be. But it is not the case that my love of my country must exclude or preclude love of all humanity, right? We can embrace the notion of world citizenship even as we embrace the notion of national identity and national pride. For those who are suspicious of that, it's worth noting that not all that many years ago, in the United States, people were Georgians or Virginians or Massachusettsians and had no notion that they could be anything greater than that, right? And we managed to not only overcome that, but to capitalize on that to foster growth and development. So overcoming nationalism in what I would think of as its virulent forms, in the forms that are anti-other or anti-global community, needs to be addressed. Religious strife, in some sense, we have talked about. It is essential that we return to the core foundations of religious belief, where there is this significant commonality, and where it's not the case that conflict between religions is warranted, where we instill in believers of all faiths the notion that there is this common body of truth. And of course, it's the case that it manifests itself differently in location X or at time Y, but that fundamentally there is this common faith. So reducing religious strife will be an essential element of achieving peace. Addressing or achieving the full equality of women and men in our societies will be essential. Notably, this is not just an issue of denying to half of humanity the full rights of their humanity and citizenship. It also is degrading of the other half of humanity. So fundamentally, the lack of equality of women and men promotes in men mindsets and attitudes and habits that go from the family to the workplace, to political life, and ultimately to international relations. So the same quality of mind, the same mindset that motivates discrimination against women in the home stands in the way of world peace, because it's the same psychology of inequality, of superiority, of power that basically makes it then hard for us to achieve world peace as well, and everything along the way, to have a healthy national order, to have well-functioning companies that thrive, so on and so forth. So that will be critical. Two more that I would put on this list of, again, critical ingredients of or steps along the path to achieving world peace. Universal education. Fundamentally, I was recently in a meeting with someone who's written a book called Education is Freedom. And he was talking about his starting point is his own life. And the education his parents did not receive, and the education he in turn received, and then what that did for him. But then he uses all these other examples to highlight the way in which there is no such thing as freedom without education, right? That's true of individuals, but it's equally true of states and nations and our global order. So achieving universal education is critical. If we think about the perpetuation of prejudice and why societies fall, ignorance arguably is the most common theme in those phenomena. Ignorance is the most common source of those. It's also worth noting that if in fact, and this comes from the Baha'i teachings again, if in fact it's the case that education must be limited, although that shouldn't be our goal, that there's a scarcity of educational opportunity, priority should be given for those educational opportunities to girls and women over boys and men, because as a matter of perpetuating the social order of the value of education, the problematics of ignorance, so on and so forth, women and mothers are more likely to be the natural bearer of that than men are. And as a, now, again, that's not the first choice. That's the second choice. But if that choice is faced, there's a place for that as well. And then the last one I'd mention as one of these goals, and I have a few other things I want to tell you about, as the kind of the pathways is facilitating communication. I mentioned technology is facilitating this, but I also mentioned one of these Baha'i teachings, which is the notion of a universal auxiliary language. So the idea that I speak English, you speak Spanish, they speak French, they speak Swahili, but that we also have some common language that all of us speak that allow us to communicate and engage effectively across that. So these are some of the building blocks or pillars, you might say, of achieving peace. But in reality, there's an even deeper ingredient or contributing factor to achieving peace. And that's really about our inner state of, that goes to our inner state of mind. It goes to a spiritual and moral attitude. Thus, all of these goals are worthy goals, are great goals, are important things to achieve. But fundamentally, if we think about them as purely pragmatic, we would have more money if women fully participate in the economy. Racism produces economic decline. So if we think about it in purely pragmatic terms, we won't achieve fully the results. So what is that state of mind? Ultimately, it is a fundamental appreciation of the oneness of humanity. The notion that fundamentally, at its heart, deep down, humanity is one. Humanity is united in this critical way. We've got to abandon any notion that based on race or class or color or creed, nation, sex, degree of material civilization, etc. The notion that anyone, any individual, any group, any society, any group, any nation is superior in one way or another to others. This fundamentally is the prerequisite to achieving world peace. There is no path to achieving world peace without universal acceptance of this spiritual principle, the spiritual principle that fundamentally we are all united, we are all one. Again, I want to sort of quickly refer to a couple of passages from the Baha'i writings on this theme. So the notion that let me skip over that one. That one's a little long. I'm going to share my screen again. If I can get to it here. All right. So again, I put this up because again, it's long. I do think it's sort of it captures something important here. And the basic notion is that when we talk about the oneness of humanity, there can be some tendency or some inclination to think of that as exclusive of national identity, exclusive of national pride, again, as I mentioned earlier, as undermining what it is that we have in our global order today. And this passage from the Baha'i writings kind of responds to that, I think. So let me read it, and again, you can read along and take a look at it. Far from aiming at the subversion of the existing foundations of society, the principle of oneness seeks to broaden its basis, to remold its institutions in a manner consonant with the needs of an ever-changing world. It can conflict with no legitimate allegiances, nor can it undermine essential loyalties. Its purpose is neither to stifle the flame of a sane and intelligent patriotism in men's hearts, nor to abolish the system of national autonomy so essential if the evils of excessive centralization are to be avoided. It does not ignore, nor does it attempt to suppress the diversity of ethnical origins, of climate, of history, of language and tradition, of thought and habit that differentiate the peoples and nations of the world. It calls for a wider loyalty, for a larger aspiration than any that has animated the human race. It insists upon the subordination of national impulses and interests to the imperative claims of a unified world. It repudiates excessive centralization on one hand and disclaims all attempt at uniformity on the other. Its watchword is unity in diversity. So this conception of oneness fundamentally is a prerequisite to achieving world peace. Unless, as human individuals and societies and groups, we can embrace this notion, which is not, again, as the passage highlights, is not to the exclusion of the value of, the significance of, the importance of national identity, diversity, other loyalties, hence this notion of unity in diversity, but that calls us to a higher calling. And again, to a theme that I've mentioned a few times, to this notion of progressive educators, progressive revelation. If someone had said 300 or 400 or 500 years ago, had said we have to be globally united, the response would be that at that time, people didn't even know what the globe was. They thought it was flat, and they thought it ended at the water near their home. There was no notion of global. Even 200 years ago or 250 years ago, the notion of shifting from state and nation to something broader was a significant leap, as I mentioned earlier. So in some ways, again, and this also goes to the theme of the evolution of our society, of us as humanity, that we are now at a stage where we are capable of achieving what you are seeing on this screen in terms of fundamentally understanding the value proposition that we are one community, that we are fundamentally united and one. Another passage, again, just to highlight this, Baha'u'llah, again, I mentioned the Prophet founder says, the well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. Let me read it one more time. The well-being of mankind, its peace and security are unattainable unless and until its unity is firmly established. So fundamentally then, this quality of mind, this spiritual moral attitude of oneness, that we are fundamentally one as individuals, must animate what we are doing. If we do all of those things that I said, equality of women and men, elimination of racism, elimination of extremes of wealth and poverty, communication mechanisms, and we don't have that fundamental value, we won't achieve world peace. It won't lead to world peace, because that is, in essence, what's behind it. Let me move to my last few points I want to make, and then I want to make sure we have time for questions. How is it that all of this then gets manifested? One element of it is a system of global security. We already have this collective security, I should say. So the notion here is that there is a need for humanity to protect itself against aggression, against things, but that should not lay in the hands of individual nation states, or at least individual nation states alone. Why? Because when individual states do it alone, it is a breeding ground for conflict and perpetual conflict in a way that a global order of security avoids. So that's one element. A second element of this kind of global order that might follow from addressing these issues, from establishing or instilling this fundamental value of the oneness of humanity, is some system of global governance. What form that takes, we will have to see, but some notion of that there is some executive power, some legislative power, some judicial power that exists globally will be part of that. The reality is that we are seeing that already. We already have institutions that, at least in certain areas, are functioning in that way. And the question is how those might evolve over time. And the third element is economic interdependence. So here, this was one of my areas of research and work back in the day, was about international trade. The reality is that when we talk about something is manufactured or produced in a given country, there's no longer any such thing. Any sophisticated, complicated good is a product of things that are coming out of, on the low end, 5 or 10 countries, on the high end, 40 or 50 countries. Your car wasn't made in any country. Your car was made in 30 countries, depending on the constituent parts of it. Even the most simple products are a product of inputs and materials and manufacturing for them. So economic interdependence is a third prong of that. Last point I want to sort of offer about the theme of unity and theme of oneness. So I've said that unity and oneness are a prerequisite for peace, right? And again, this passage that the unification of all the peoples of the world in one family is the prerequisite but it turns out it's also the ultimate goal. So world peace is not an end unto itself. And as if you start with the notion that the basic underlying notion that we have is the motivating force is this attitude, this mindset of the oneness of humanity, then peace is merely the groundwork for the fundamental unity of humanity, right? So we have to pursue unity and have to instill this value of unity to achieve world peace. But ultimately, world peace then becomes the means to achieve this global dynamic of unity. And again, a passage that captures that from the Baha'i writings: unification of the whole of mankind is the hallmark of the stage which human society is now approaching. I'll read it one more time. Unification of the whole of mankind is the hallmark of the stage which human society is now approaching. Unity of family, of tribe, of city, state, and nation have been successively attempted and firmly established. So unity of family, of tribe, of city, state, and nation have been successfully attempted and fully established. World unity is the goal towards which the harassed humanity is now striving. So we are now at a stage where that's possible for the first time in human history. So what is it then, broadly, to close, kind of what are thematically, kind of what have we identified? We've identified fundamentally that faith is central to achieving world peace. If we're to achieve world peace, faith and spirit and morality are central to that. We've identified this fundamental value attitude of oneness as central to that goal. I want to close with one more that I think is important, and that's the notion of consultation. So Baha'is talk about this idea that having candid, dispassionate, and cordial conversation, consultation, dialogue, having the capacity as individuals and as societies and even as nations to be able to, in a reflective and respectful way, engage those who differ in their views, but communicate with them and learn from them and teach them and come out ultimately with a better truth, with a greater truth, is essential to the pathway to peace as well. That is true of all of us as individuals and as societies. And ultimately, in the Baha'i vantage, it is true structurally as well, that ultimately, how will we achieve world peace is when we can bring together the leaders from all nations, the leaders from all communities, into a global assemblage to sit down and, with this attitude of faith and spirit, with a fundamental commitment to oneness, be able to, at that stage, engage one another about how do we alleviate these issues, how do we address these issues that I've identified, and thereby achieve world peace. All right, so let me stop there. I hope some of this was interesting and helpful. Again, I'm grateful for the opportunity to share with you all, and I'm happy to answer questions, of course, but also engage in dialogue around thoughts and reflections that folks have.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ahdieh, for your talk. I loved how you went in depth in, honestly, almost all the aspects of peace. So I really appreciate that. So we do have time for questions now. So if anyone has a question, they can put it in the chat, and I'll read it out. So we have one question so far. It says, what responsibilities do individual Baha'is have in promoting peace within their communities and the wider world?
Okay, so, and I would say individual Baha'is, but I would broaden it to sort of what role do individuals have at this stage in advancing these. So fundamentally, I do think the more we are individually reflecting in our values and in our efforts, this reflections of this fundamental orientation to oneness, the more we are able to foster at the individual level and then the community level and beyond, kind of the structure and the values that achieve that. Many of us, many Baha'is sort of do that, many other individuals do that, but the redoubling of those efforts, another one way to say is that in the face of the conflicts we see around the world, there's not much that we as individuals can do to alleviate suffering in Ukraine and in Gaza and in Myanmar and in Africa and elsewhere. But what we can do is we can, in our own lives, reflect the fundamental values that achieve that. That's one. Second one I would say is, again, I do think and this is, again, it's true of Baha'is, but it's true of others as well. It is the case that there is a cynicism about religious truth and the value of religion that is that is deeply problematic and is completely inconsistent with what I described. It's worth emphasizing. So I do think kind of the more we can reflect as individuals and as communities, whether it's the Baha'i community or other religious communities, the power of religion to advance social good, the power of religion to reduce and respond to racism, to respond to inequality of women and men, to respond to the disparity of wealth and poverty. All of that, from my vantage, creates a level of receptivity to the role of faith, to the role of religion in society, to the strengthening of that wing of the bird that is critical to sort of shift the thinking from where we are today. And I don't think there's any denying that's where we are today, which is that the answer to these problems lies in, at a minimum, not religion, and maybe affirmatively in pushing religion aside, i.e. that notion of religion as the source of the conflict, the source of disunity, rather than a source of unity and a source of bringing together and a source of peace.
Thank you. Another question asks, the Baha'i principle of consultation is crucial for conflict resolution. How could we effectively use consultation to resolve disputes and build consensus on a global scale?
So again, say a little more about it. So again, for those who are not familiar with it, so the Baha'i idea is that all decision-making really in Baha'i communities and in homes of Baha'is and others should be defined by or shaped by this notion of consultation, which is, we can talk about consultation in lots of ways, but the fundamental notion that I think of it as is it's a search for truth, which means it's different than I'm trying to articulate my idea or convince you of my idea. One of the notions that's super difficult, I don't think consultation is easy by any stretch of imagination, but it's that once you put an idea out, it's no longer yours. Now, think about what that means. Like the way we normally converse is, I want to convince Bayan of something, right? I have that idea in my head. So I say something. He agrees, great, then the conversation's done. He pushes back in some way. Now I have to respond, right? And I have to say, no, but here's why my idea, right? The notion that it's no longer my idea is so alien to the way we generally approach this kind of dialogue and conversation. But I think, the more we can practice that in our family lives, in our work lives, in our, other communities we're part of, the more we manifest again the possibility of this working. But I don't want to be glib about that. It's very hard to do. It's very hard for us to do as individuals, and it's very hard to do when you are not surrounded by others who share that goal, right? Because it will oftentimes feel like, wait, I gave up my idea, but they're not giving up their idea, right? So it can be very difficult to do it, but I do think the more we can apply it, and I would say to the Baha'is who are thinking of this, do it explicitly. Say, listen, for what it's worth, this is something we do. It may or may not work. And don't be overly kind of ideological about it. It may or may not work, but this is a tool that we might try as a way to navigate this. And it's not going to in one fell swoop do, but I think if people see that modeled and experience it, then there's the possibility of it spreading. And again, it is, from my vantage, a fundamental tool of how it is that we ultimately achieve peace at the global level, let alone at the community, state, city, whatever level.
Thank you. Another question asks, could you explain if the United Nations had to evolve to a world government, what changes would need to take place?
Oh, shoot, that's a lot. The Saveda Mahani, my cousin, he has written a number of books on this, so I would commend her work to you and others too. She's just one of many who've written on this topic. So fundamentally, the United Nations was a product of the world out of which it arose, in which there was a fundamental global conflict that was bipolar, and so there was this side and there was this side, and it was the best effort to kind of try and balance that. In some ways, if you don't alleviate that, right, and as if you don't do the other things we've talked about, it's hard to fix the United Nations in any sense. Now, it always is worth emphasizing, the United Nations in a lot of areas works incredibly effectively, right? United Nations is what we think of as the General Assembly and Security Council, but then there's this whole array of other institutions that are doing incredible work. And so when I talk about reduction of poverty, the United Nations gets probably more credit for that than any other institution or nation or policy or the like. And but if you talk about those core institutions, fundamentally, as long as we live in this world in which we start with the base of conflict. It's going to limit the ability of the institution to do that. So what would it look like? It probably looks like at some point the collective security elements of the United Nations have some autonomous capacity to be exercised independent of the veto power of a handful of nations, right? Then again, that fundamentally, the United Nations acts, for lack of a word, autonomously. But that's a big jump. But that would have to happen there. Likewise, we would have to see a change in the use of the United Nations as a political platform. So it is the case that on lots of issues, the United Nations becomes paralyzed because of the veto power in the Security Council. But as often as not, it's paralyzed because countries are advancing political agendas rather than trying to use the institution as it was intended, as a mechanism for global consultation, global engagement, and global involvement with alleviating some of these fundamental issues.
Thank you. Another question asks, I'm afraid that things won't really change until, quote, mankind is brought to its knees. Despite all the positive things that are happening that you mentioned, we seem to be more divided than ever. What is your advice when speaking with people who embrace conspiracy theories? My experience is that it's a bottomless pit.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I don't want to take anything away from the fact that there are terrible negatives, and including some things that look to be trending in the wrong direction. More divided than ever. Again, it's hard to say. Again, so I grew up at a time when at school they would have us crawl under the table because that's what we were supposed to do if a nuclear attack was coming, right? So we don't do a lot of that with children right now, and so that's progress, I'd say. So I think there are ways in which we are less divided, but to be clear, there are lots of ways in which we remain terribly divided. And some of the other references in the question are talking about on the domestic side. So here's what I would say. I don't think the solution to most problems, this is where I wear my lawyer hat, the solution to most problems lies in the tails. It's rarely the case that people who believe conspiracy theories of one end or the other end are receptive to things. But the truth of the matter is that those really are the tails. The overwhelming majority of humanity that's not where they are. But instead are somewhere in that middle range of, we want a solution. I have a view of that solution, or I have thoughts on how we get to that solution, but I don't know the answer to that. And so I would say again, expending energy on that population is more likely to be impactful. The media and online social media and so on tends to accentuate the tails because it makes for good copy. In the old days, we used to say with local news, if it bleeds, it leads. You begin as you start with crime and someone was murdered or shot or whatever else it is. The same thing is true here. It's a much more interesting story to say someone believes something extreme on this end or on this end than it is to say this person is trying to figure out the answer. So I would say again, there are a lot of those folks out there. We're at a moment where it's almost there's a pull to the tails, so it's hard to say that. Like you sound like you're betraying something, or you lack conviction if you don't adopt one extreme or the other. But I would say again, the more of us who do that at the one-on-one individual level, the more there's space for that kind of middle to be more vocalized. And then at some point you find, again, even in the tail, some of those people say like, actually, I didn't really believe that. And they filter into the middle. So that would be at least my thought. Though I acknowledge it's a very challenging issue.
Thank you. Another question asks, I would love your views on something that I've been observing and reflecting on. We as Baha'is are not immune, of course, from social illnesses. And unless we up our immunity with deepening, etc., we're vulnerable to this. Sadly, I see some friends who get pulled into some of the discourses, such as globalist agenda and other discourses that contradict fundamental teachings and approaches in the faith and are divisive. How do we work together as institutions to address this potential disunifying impact of these realities and focus our attention on the teachings as the healing medicine for this day?
Awesome. So it's a great question. And again, it's hard because again, we look at the world, and if you have a set of values that are about the betterment of humanity, and you say like, I want a better humanity, Like, I'm going to go out and better humanity, right? One of the ways in which that's manifested is by speaking up and by engaging in X, Y, and Z. So a couple of thoughts I have about that. First, it is the case that we are diverse, even within the Baha'i community, within any community. So I think there is some room for more flexibility in that regard. I mean, it's not that everyone has to approach issues exactly the way I approach them, or you approach them, or somebody else approaches them. So I think there's some room for flexibility, and we shouldn't create opportunities for disunity around them. That's one. Two, I do think it is important that we recognize, and this is in the Baha'i writings, that we recognize that the capacity of any individual to, or even community, or the entire Baha'i community, or in any community, to single-handedly, change the path, or shift the path, or change the dial, is limited. And so in some ways, the question is, in the face of scarce time, scarce energy, scarce resources, where is that best directed? And to my mind, and I think this is consistent with what the teachings say, Baha'i teachings say, to my mind, it's best directed to engaging these fundamental who we are. What are our values as individuals and as communities? Why is oneness important, right? That can be less satisfying because it's not what everybody else is waving a placard about or posting on social media about or whatever else it is. But if the goal truly is, I want to have an impact over time, it may well be there's more impact to be had from that than from the other the social action. Now, last thing I'll say is, it is also the case that at the moment, and this is a little bit, I think, a product of social media and communication and the like, a large part of what qualifies as being active and engaged really is just expressive, right? I posted something on my social media account, I said something, I yelled something, or whatever else it is. I don't want to take anything away from that having some place, but we also shouldn't overestimate the degree to which that really is meaningful action. Right. So if we're talking about social action, I would say, first question I would ask, is it social action? And if it's social action, great. Then there's some social action that may be more disunifying and some that may be more unifying or less disunifying. Pick the one. I would advise that one. But start with the question of whether it's actually social action. I think is critical and important.
Thank you. We have a question asking, how do the Baha'i community building activities such as children's classes and the Junior Youth Spiritual Empowerment Program help in cultivating a generation committed to peace and service?
Great. So for those who aren't Baha'is, the Baha'i community kind of has a framework, I would say, for building spiritually based, resilient communities. And that's not limited to within the Baha'i community. It's a broad and outward-facing effort, and there's various prongs of that. But one prong of it is a strong emphasis on children's classes that are designed to uplift children in terms of their spirit, but frankly also in terms of their commitment and engagement with education and empowerment more broadly. And then that extends then into young adults, junior youth. I'm sorry, I said junior youth as well. So those programs really are community-based, grassroots, that are designed to empower the members of a community to do that. So now if we think back to then the theme that I'm talking about the fundamental oneness and equality of all of us, the idea that it's not, I'm here to save you, or I'm here to educate you, right? Fundamentally speaks to that, right? It's reflective of, and it in some sense instills that value of oneness in a significant way. The children's classes and junior youth empowerment program also sort of kind of do lots of things to advance some of those other goals that we talked about. So equality of women and men, by virtue of who participates, who the leaders are, who the animators are in those programs, the elimination of racism, where these are community-based, and so you're going to draw in the entire length and breadth of the community, right? Reflects that as well. The even equality, reducing disparities of wealth and poverty. Fundamentally, the origin of this program of children's classes and junior youth empowerment is actually social and economic development, right? It is designed to bring resources and wealth, and not wealth in a crass way, but resources and access to wealth to communities where it has not always been there, or oftentimes it's not there. And so I would say that, again, those institutions are the kinds of building blocks of achieving or of advancing world oneness and of advancing world peace that we can look at and that the Baha'i community is kind of engaged in.
Thank you. And we kind of have an extension to that question about the Training Institute. How do study circles contribute to creating a peaceful and cohesive community?
Same principle. So so again, for those who aren't familiar with it, so one other element of this kind of raising of human resources is this idea of study circles, and it's kind of a relatively structured kind of program of study. But the idea is that you are instilling in folks both the values and the skills to be able to contribute to the well-being, spiritual and otherwise, of their communities. And so the institute process is that the broad frame that we use for that, and the study circles is this one component of it. And so same principle. I would say that, again, it is a tool that is designed to advance those fundamental values of oneness, of equality, of access to resources, and reducing extremes of well, consultation. I can add to that mix as well. That if we develop those skills, we then are kind of at the grassroots level creating the conditions that make it possible to do that at the next level up, and at the national level, and ultimately at the international level.
Thank you. And we have a further extension on that question. How do devotional gatherings, what role do they play in building a sense of community?
We're covering all the bases. All right. So another element, probably I should have begun with this. So another element of that broad process that the Baha'i community is kind of engaged with is devotional gatherings. And so here the notion is that these are not, unlike children's classes, junior youth empowerment, study circles, they are not concretely directed to, we are undertaking this action, but they are creating kind of the spiritual bonds and the spiritual, individual spiritual conditions that make us receptive and create the conducive conditions for all those other things to occur. So in those devotional gatherings take all sorts of forms around, communities, individuals, families, and the idea is that thing. So to what I said earlier about the fundamental need to reorient ourselves away from a materialistic orientation, or a purely materialistic orientation, to one that embraces both that wing of the bird and the spiritual side of the house, that brings religion and spirituality and faith back into the dialogue in terms of the social order and structure. Fundamentally, that's what devotional gatherings are doing, right? They are in essence situating in the middle of the dialogue the relevance of spirit and faith in a way that they are not. And again, you see this in the numbers of declining participation in church and religiosity and whatever. So fundamentally, devotional gatherings are, I think, speaking to that, the importance of recentering faith and religion and spirituality in kind of who we are as individuals, and in turn, what our social order looks like.
Thank you. And it looks like our final question for today asks, what do you think should be the role of the United Nations, governments, and indeed Baha'is outside of Iran about the situation of Baha'is in Iran today?
So I mentioned that the Baha'i Faith, at the beginning, I mentioned the Baha'i Faith originated in the Middle East, originated in Iran in the mid-19th century, in the mid-1800s. Not an uncommon story that in its place of origin, almost every religion has suffered some amount of persecution, because again, it's challenging the kind of the prevailing sort of social order. So that was true at the establishment of the Baha'i Faith in Iran in the mid-1800s, when tens of thousands of Baha'is were killed because of their belief, because of their embrace of the Baha'i teachings. That's persisted in the years since then in Iran, as well as to some degree in certain other Muslim and other countries, I should probably fairly say. In Iran, in recent years, kind of the level of persecution after the Islamic Revolution there, but again, kind of the last few years, we've seen a resurgence in the persecution of Iran, ranging from execution and killing of Baha'is, but also a wide array of kind of civil rights persecution, lack of access to education, lack of access to healthcare services, arbitrary imprisonment, these kinds of things. And so in terms of the role, it has been the case historically that outside pressure, even in a regime such as that in Iran, does important work in terms of limiting the worst abuses. And so the continued attention of the United Nations, of other national governments, of local communities, and of individuals to the plight of the Baha'is in Iran has been important. If you go to, there's various websites, Baha'i.org and others, they talk about kind of the persecution and the ways in which, by engaging members of Congress, by engaging global institutions, by just sharing news and information about what's happening to the Baha'is in Iran in terms of, again, in being imprisoned because they are teachers, being imprisoned because they refuse to deny their faith or they deny their beliefs. That attention is significant in limiting the worst of it. I don't think it's going to in any way, I don't think it's going to in any direct way stop that persecution, but it limits the most extreme forms of it.
I want to thank you again, Mr. Ahdieh, for your talk. I think all these questions really deepened our understanding on the practical applications of peace and what we all can do. So I want to thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Banja. It's a pleasure to be with you guys.
So next week, our speaker will be Mr. Rainn Wilson, and his topic will be a spiritual conversation with Rainn Wilson. And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern time, so you can invite your friends and family. And if you're new to the Baha'i Faith, or if you'd like to be added to our mailing list, you can fill out the Google form that I will put in the chat. Thank you, everyone. Hope to see you all next Saturday. Have a great week.